Hi, and welcome back to Glassboxed, my top 10 tech tips. Today we're going to look through my top 10 tips for what I think are the most common asked questions for a junior QA's interview. We will look through what I think are the most common questions asked in no particular order of importance. So without further ado, let's begin. Number 1. Asked to test a physical object. In your interview, you might be handed a physical object to test. This could be anything. This could be a pencil, it could be a phone, a piece of paper, anything. You're typically asked to test a physical object to help judge your ability to analyze something and test it. The reason it's an arbitrary object is because usually this is to throw you off. So for instance, if you're going in for a technical tester's role, you'll probably expect to be asked how to test maybe a website or how to write some kind of unit test. But if you're asked something really arbitrary, really random, for instance, here's a can of Coke maybe, test it. Just be prepared to expect to be asked to test something that you wouldn't really test as part of your role. Number 2. General questions around your core language. So if the role you're going for involves writing most of your tests in Java, then expect some questions to be asked around Java as general questions. For instance, you might be asked to explain inheritance in Java. You might be asked to describe multiple different collection types. You could be asked to name maybe a couple of differences between Java and other programming languages. So just be aware that you might be asked some questions around the actual language that you'll probably use on a day-to-day basis for the role you're applying for. Number 3. Asked about testing strategies. There's a really good chance you'll be asked how to test something when something happens. For instance, let's just say you're given a login page. You might be asked, how do you test this login page? What kind of testing scenarios would you write to test this login page? Those who are manual testers would probably say something along the lines of, I would check to see if I'm able to log in using valid credentials and invalid credentials. I test to make sure that I'm able to enter characters into the input fields and I'm able to press a button regardless of whether there's information available inside the fields or not. Providing that kind of answer gives the suggestion that you're more manual than technical. If you answer with something along the lines of, I probably stub the back end, then put in some information in the front end, push the button, then see the expected result on the back end and see what happens. I'd also try and remove the back end completely. Try and log in using valid and invalid credentials and then see what happens. I might even open the console window on a browser, log in using normal manual intervention methods, and see what the console outputs, see what kind of HTTP status codes I get back. Given an answer like that gives the impression that you're far more technical than manual, or it gives the impression that you definitely understand the technical requirements of what would be needed to test that login page as well as the manual requirements. Number 4. Ask to test a web page. So this probably stems from number 3, but it's a little different in that if you're asked to actually test a web page, so you're sitting in front of a computer, maybe testing a web page, you'll probably be expected to do a lot of the happy paths and unhappy paths. In fact, you might be expected to mention the actual phrase, what is the happy path and what is the unhappy path, and go through that. You might even be expected to ask, can I have a look at the information that's persisted when I log in? Where is it persisted? How is it persisted? So make sure that when you're asked to test something that you fully understand what is you're trying to test. And when I say fully understand, I mean try and get the best understanding you can possible about what happens when you push a button, not just what you visually see, but especially the information you don't see. These questions are all disguise questions to see if you think about both black box and white box testing. Number 5. Asked about design patterns. So this is a heavy technical question in that as a manual tester, you will never come across design patterns. But as a technical tester, you'll be expected to understand some design patterns, the most common one being the page object pattern. You might be expected to answer and understand other patterns as well. So just be aware of the different patterns, especially the page object pattern and the page factory pattern, since they are the most commonly used patterns when writing automated tests. Number 6. Asked to write a test. There is a really high probability you'll actually be asked to write a test. So for instance, this might not be on a computer, it might just be on paper. In an interview, the interviewers are usually not very fussed about seeing if you syntactically get something right or not. It's more important to them to understand if you're able to actually plan out a test in your mind, structure it correctly, and write it out. You might be asked to convert some method they've written in a main class. For instance, in a main class, you might have something along the lines of going to some web page using a Selenium WebDriver instance, and then checking the title of something by doing a system out. And that might be it. They might then ask you to translate that into a test of your chosen framework. So if you want, you can write it in JUnit. If you want, you can write it in other frameworks. The key things to note when writing a test is that make sure you don't make what I call funny mistakes or silly mistakes. Don't try and write too many assertions in the same test. Don't try and write a test method that does something completely different. Make sure you do really simple things really clearly, such as naming your test using appropriate names. When writing a test, go the extra mile. Start writing stuff like before and after hooks for your test as well. If need be, start writing a page object if the scenario calls for it. Doing stuff like that really outlines your true technical understanding of writing tests. Number 7. Asked to write some SQL. There's a really good chance you'll be asked to demonstrate your SQL abilities. For someone who's going into a technical role for the first time, you won't be expected to understand SQL to a really great length. You will be expected to understand at the minimum the basics. So for instance, one of the most common questions asked is, what's the difference between deleting and dropping in SQL? You might also be given two tables which are related, and you might be asked to write a statement which grabs information from both of these tables and displays something relevant only to you. So for instance, you might be given a table such as an address table that contains an address of people, and you might be given another table which contains just the people, and you might be asked, for given person A in the person's table, find their address in the address table. Writing statements like that, if you are able to write them with confidence, shows that A, you've got a basic understanding, and B, because you have a basic understanding, if there is a gap in understanding SQL to a greater length, it can easily be filled. Number 8. Asked about personal work, blogs and projects. As a technical tester, there is an assumption that you work on technical projects, blogs, or some other work outside of work. No, I'm not saying you don't have a life or anything silly like that. What I'm saying is, as a technical tester, there's almost some kind of nature in a developer to work on technical challenges outside of their role to increase their understanding. Now, you don't have to have a personal project, you don't have to have blogs, obviously, it's not some kind of requirement. But having these things really differentiates you from everyone else, especially if you're able to prove you've got some projects where you've actually had some outside people commenting on them, contributing towards them, praising you, and similarly not praising you, in that they're trying to give you suggestions on how to improve, and you actually feed back on that. It shows that you've got a greater influence outside of your role, which is, in some circles, an important skill to have. Number 9. Asked about your experience on your CV. Okay, so this is probably a given. Whatever you put down on your CV, you'll probably be asked questions around it. But the point I'm trying to raise through this particular point is that when you jump from one job to another, most of the time you actually pick up new skills, but in the process you can actually forget old skills. So for instance, you might have had a role where you did some SQL queries, but not a lot. You might have then moved on to another role which didn't require any SQL at all. And the new role you're applying for right now might require SQL. Now you may or may not have brushed up on it before your interview. But let's just say on your CV you've written you've done SQL for 2-3 years, about a year ago. Your interviewer will expect you to understand a great deal about SQL because you've written you've got 2 years worth of SQL experience. So what I'm saying in this point is effectively whatever skills you have for all of your given jobs, make sure that you've got at the minimum a basic understanding of what those skills are. It also shows that you actually carry knowledge over from one role to another, even if you don't use it. Number 10. Ask scenario-based questions. So number 10 is probably an aggregation, or is probably similar to some of these 9 points already mentioned. Scenario-based questions are, you'll be given some kind of scenario, and the scenarios can be exceptionally random. They will most likely be related to a testing natured question, but they might not be what you expect. So for instance, you might be asked something along the lines of, what do you do on a day-to-day activity as a tester? And the answer you will give will paint a picture of the way you think, the way you do things. So for instance, if you say something like, the first thing I do is check my emails, check my meetings, see if there's anything I need to catch up on, stuff like that. That gives the impression that you're much more manual than technical. If on the other hand you say something along the lines of, the first thing I do is probably check the results of last night's bamboo plans, see if any tests have failed or passed. If they've passed, I'll probably move on to writing more automated tests for other scenarios which are most likely still on my plate. If a test failed, then I'd look into why it's failing. I'd either go in, fix the test, but most likely the test won't be broken because the nature of a test is to see if something else is broken. So depending on what the failure is, I'd either go in, fix the code, or fix the test. Answering like that gives the impression that you think a lot more technically than you do manually. And that's it for this video, folks. If you enjoyed my top 10 video, then please subscribe and rate. If you have any questions or video suggestions, then please leave a comment below. Many thanks for watching. Until next time, ciao.